All right, here we are, chapter 14, lymphatic and immune systems. I'll talk a little bit about the immune systems, and I put in a slide about how the vaccines work. So hopefully, if you don't know by now, you should get a pretty good understanding. So what's the function of the lymphatic system? It carries away excess interstitial fluid. It fights pathogens, which we normally associate this with, cancerous cells and toxins. And then when it is abnormal, can cause cancer, autoimmune disease, and allergies. So we talk a little bit about, when we talk about AIDS, how we really don't die of AIDS. We die from complication from AIDS because it suppresses the immune system. And so here's just a little bit of a rundown of the lymphatic system and how it's associated with the blood supply. And we'll talk a little bit more about like white blood cells. We talked about red blood cells before, but white blood cells would be part of this. And so I'll include those at a later time. So what organs consist of the lymphatic system? We have our lymph nodes. It contains large amounts of lymphocytes and macrophages or phages. And they do swell when you get sick, right? Because your body is fighting off infection. The thymus gland, it will decrease in size over time. We'll talk about the T cells and B cells, but the T cell is a type of immune cell. The maturity of the T cell located just below the sternum. And I think we've pointed it out before, possibly in the endocrine system. And the spleen filters the blood located next to the stomach. All right, so there's the spleen, and we can remove the spleen if it gets infected, but it does adversely impact your immune system. All right, so what are some pathogens that cause infection? Viruses, obviously, we're pretty well known about those right now. Bacteria, fungi, and protozoans, like just mostly in the water supply. We'll talk a little bit about that right here. Waterborne infection, right, is contaminated drinking water, mostly in the third world countries where they don't have a sewer system. And it's two diseases that are common with this is cholera and typhoid. And then obviously this is, it's diarrhea, and it could be like severe dehydration, and then it can cause death. Airborne, which was we talk about the COVID, is airborne or droplet infection spread by coughing and sneezing. If you ever seen that, Mythbusters about the cough, the sneezing, it's pretty eye-opening, I'd say. Contact infection. Usually these are a little bit harder because you do need to be in close contact with the person who has the infection, usually through sexual contact, bodily fluids, or puncture wounds. That would be common. There would be some health workers who, when they get stuck with a needle, they can get infected with certain diseases. All right, so what's the first line of defense? And we call this non-specific because it doesn't matter what disease is there. It's just there to, that first line. So it is just to protect against many types of pathogens, not like in general, right? Non-specific. Some species may be resistant to diseases that affect other species, right? And that's actually true because some viruses and bacteria can affect us and not affect other organisms. So what's our mechanical barrier? Skin, right? Our hair, mucous membranes, right? If it's like if you ever get like congested, that's our non-specific defense, right? The mucus is building up, trying to keep the pathogens out of our respiratory system. What are the more second line? So beyond those, we have the enzymes, right? Gastric juice, hydrochloric acid, pepsin, our tears. We have things in our eyes, our lysosomes, which are break down foreign objects and get rid of them in our cells, and then our perspiration, which includes salt, and those types of things. Another non-specific defense is fever. When we get sick, just our body is trying to find that particular infection, elevates the body temperature. above 99 degrees, and brain damage starts at 107. And as we mentioned before, I think is that, when we get to 103, 104, we need to make sure that we monitor it and go to the doctor if it continues. Maybe a little bit lower for infants because they can't regulate their body temperature as well. Inflammation, response to injury or infection, blood vessel dilation, which increases the blood volume and will again increase the amount of white blood cells that go to a particular area. And we'll, I should include those notes about the white blood cells and their bacteria. All right. Phagocytosis. So this is neutrophils. So this is phagocytosis means that it engulfs a particular foreign substance and will break it down. And it patrols the lymph and blood, spleen, liver, bone marrow, right? So if you could actually have time-lapse simulation of these phagocytosis going on. So it's sort of monocytes would be a type of white blood cells, and then we have the macrophages, who are the actual types that devour the cell. And we'll talk about those. All right, so natural killer cells, and this is where we're going to talk about lymphocytes, right? Another type of white blood cell. Defends against viruses and cancer cells, secrete substances that lyse or cut the cell membrane and destroys it. The more I talk about this lecture, the more I should maybe do the white blood cell lecture as well. So I'll include that. So now we're talking about the specific. It's also called adaptive immune response, and this would be the third line. So this is acquired immunity. So these are, when we say acquired immunity, when the body recognizes things that it's seen before and it attacks a specific pathogen. So we have these things called memory cells, which include the B cells. So it's sort of interesting the way that the immune system works. And we'll show you more of a picture. The T cells, we have two different types of T cells. We have the helper T cell and the cytotoxic T cell. Again, these mature in the thymus gland. And then we have the B cells, which are plasma cells and memory cells. And so those are exactly what, so if it recognizes a foreign object, it elicits the T cells to go and attack the foreign object. Antigen presenting cell activates the T cells, macrophages B cells. It phagocytizes, just sort of engulfs. It's a fancy word for engulfing, and lyses it, cuts it apart. And the bacterial antigens move to the surface of the macrophage, and then those antigens are displayed. So when we talk mostly about antibodies, right? Antibodies attack or adhere to the antigens so it can destroy it, right? So the antigens are what resides on the particular virus, bacterial cell. And bacterial cells are large enough where those antibodies can attack it. And that's why we can't really have antibodies don't work on viruses because they're just so small, and they don't really have necessarily antigens so much. They just usually have proteins or spike proteins that are on there. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So the helper T cell contacts the displayed antigen, right? So and if it fits, then the helper T cell is activated, and that stimulates the B cells for antibody production for that specific antigen. So those memory cells, right? The memory that, hey, I know how to make this antibody, so I'm going to go ahead and produce it, and I'm going to attack that foreign substance, right? Or send them out. The cytotoxic T cell recognizes those non-self antigens and binds to the infected or cancerous cell. That will release a protein that will cut open in the cell, which destroys the cell. So it's pretty fascinating how it works. So humoral response, this is B cell activation, has a contact with the antigen, and helper T cell through the release of cytokines. And that's the proliferation of B cells. So what are memory cells? They respond to the next exposure to the antigen. Plasma cells or secrete those antibodies, which will attack it, that specific antigen, and mark for destruction. And so this is hopefully a better indicator of what will happen. So we have the virus being attacked by the macrophage, right? And so we have these helper T cells that can elicit response from the, you can see that these are going to be the antibodies. These are the green things are the antigens, and you can see that the antibodies will attack the antigen, right? So you can see those little things are the antibodies, right? And we have the B cells that will elicit. So these have the memory cells to it, so you can see how this is what it looks like. This is what this is what we remember from here, and then it will release these antibodies and help attack the antigens on that particular. All right, so antibody response is a primary response, initial encounter of a naive B cell with the antibody. So now, this is a new, the B cell doesn't recognize it, so it does take about 5 to 10 days before it, will make those antibodies to attack that particular that antigen. Secondary response 1 to 2 days for the. So okay, so this is the first time. So sorry, this is the first time you're exposed to something, 5 to 10 days before it rises enough to be able to attack it. The secondary response, if you get affected again, will only be 1 to 2 days. So it's a lot shorter time because those memory cells are already present. And then you can see here, the memory, right? So first exposure. So here's our antigen, and you can see that the exposure is just so much higher and faster. Vaccines. So there are 2 types of vaccines now, right? We're a lot better. So this is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It contains what they call adenovirus. So it's not an active virus. I think that would be the best, and it doesn't cause disease. And then it just stimulates that primary immune response, right? So it's, it contains parts of that virus, right? That is dead or weakened, right? So when you do, get a vaccine and you do feel, let's say, under the weather a little bit, it's just your immune system not recognizing that virus, and then or not the vaccine. It's treating the vaccine as a foreign object. It's not necessarily the virus. It's just that parts of that virus is recognized as a foreign object, and so we do try to fight it off, and that stimulates that primary immune response. So the mRNA, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, are what they call mRNA vaccine. So this is inserts instructions actually into the mRNA for a protein that resides on the virus. So there's 29 specific, what they call spike proteins, that reside on the COVID-19 virus. And what they do is they include instructions for one of those proteins. The body says, hey, we haven't seen this before, and then it will go ahead and elicit that response. And then I went ahead and I put up a little picture that I just grabbed off the internet. And so here are those spike proteins that we talked about, generate an mRNA sequence that codes for the spike protein. The RNA sequence making the spike is swathed in the lipid so it can enter the cell, right? So that's how it enters the cell. Once arrived, it reads the information just like a normal mRNA, just like we're going to go ahead and make enough protein, and then it will make millions of copies of that spike protein, and then that's going to go through that process and make those antibodies to attack the coronavirus. So that's how that works. What's an allergic reaction? Is an immune response which overreacts to an allergen. So, dust, pollen, drugs, food, insect bite, things like that, usually rash, hives, or itchiness. Major anaphylaxis is life-threatening when it does constrict, your breathing passages, and then if you know someone or you do yourself have a severe allergic reactions they normally carry around. They call it EpiPen, to high concentration of histamines to stop that allergic reaction. And then autoimmune. Okay, so this is when the immune system attacks itself. And here are some diseases that are considered autoimmune. So you see sometimes normally, and I think we might do this up as a project for our final, is diseases, autoimmune diseases. All right, so that's it. That is the recording, and see you tomorrow. Well, I guess only if you watch this video will you get that, but anyway.